There used to be a time when I would read one book after another, and I would perhaps have one or two books, no more, lined up. I'd read reasonably slowly. Now it's chaos. I'm looking at the books I'm going to show you here. Some I've read half of, some I will read, some I've read and given up, some I'm not sure where I am. So anyway, I'm going to rattle through them just to give you a sense of the chaos at the moment. Right, first one. I am almost finished. I am a few pages from the end of. This is called Laurus by Eugene Volodzykin, or probably Yevgeny Vodolazkin. This won lots of awards in Russia about 10 years ago. It's set in 15th century Russia, and it's about one. He starts off as a boy, ends up as an old man, and it's sort of about his journey through his life as he sort of tries to redeem himself from a tragedy that he is not in any way guilty of, but really it's a kind of weird, wonderful, picaresque, Russian magical realist novel that doesn't really obey any rules at all, but has a sense of the holy pervading all things inside and outside of ourselves. And I'm writing for it in brief for The Guardian soon. The Hatred of Poetry by Ben Lerner. Ben Lerner is a poet, and he's written two novels. One, The Okocha Station, is brilliant. His second novel, I think, is not quite as successful, but it's still very good. And this is essentially a sort of long essay, short piece of writing about how we kind of manage our expectations of what poetry ought to be and should deliver to us. And I think it's a really good piece of work. I'm only a few pages into 41 pages into Phoenicia Welby's The Mother of Darkness. I don't know Phoenicia, although we have met a couple of times, and she said some very kind things about my novel. This is her first novel, and it's shaping up as pretty good. I mean, I think it's very insightful. It's at times extremely well written. Perhaps at times she could have paid a little more attention to there's a sort of equation where you go for kind of insight plus sentence making equals great literature, and I think sometimes it's either great sentence making or insight, and not always together. But as I say, it's a kind of first novel, and very interesting. This, I'm almost at the very, very end, and someone on BookTube recommended it. I forget who that was. Lincoln's Melancholia by Joshua Wolf Schenk, and it's a sort of slightly flawed examination of Lincoln's mental state, but I think it does take us to a place in Lincoln's mental state that very few other books do take us to. But I'm not entirely convinced by it. On the other hand, it's about Lincoln, and I will read anything about Lincoln. A Fortunate Universe, Life in a Finely Tuned Cosmos. This is written by two Australian astrophysicists or whatever. One is open to the idea of God, and one is an atheist. But essentially, it's looking at the fact that the kind of cosmological constant is something like, that the probability is 0.13 zeros or whatever. Interesting in itself, it's written in a really irritatingly jokey fashion, as though essentially two scientists think this must be an appealing and engaging way to talk about science by kind of being, I don't know, not very funny. There's that. Hold on a second. You Should Come With Me Now by M. John Harrison. Short stories. People love M. John Harrison. I've never read any. I mean, here, Will Eves, a brilliant writer, Olivia Lang, a brilliant non-fiction writer, Robert Macfarlane, a brilliant writer of nature. These are all first-class writers. Write the endorsements on the back. I sense that he's not for me, but some very fine people like him. True Stories and Other Essays by Francis Bufford, as it says here, author of the best-selling Golden Hill. I think Golden Hill is unsurpassably or insurpassably something. So it is not surpassable in terms of its brilliance. And his non-fiction is brilliant too. And this is a kind of miscellaneous collection of essays, reviews, talks, and whatever. He's always worth reading. I review. There's a central section because he's a very liberal but devout Christian, and the central section is called Sacred, and I've reviewed that at length for Review 31, which is online. If you're interested in that, if I remember to put the link at the bottom, which I won't, but if I do, it'll be there. A beautiful book by the new. What are they called? Little Island Press. Darker with the Lights On, stories by David Hayden. This is getting a lot of attention in the UK as being a very important collection of short stories. On the back, we have Amir McBride of Girl's Half-Formed Thing, Kevin Barry, a novelist, Sinead Gleason, a critic, and David Collard, a critic. Are all saying wonderful things about it. I'm only 3 stories in, and whilst this might be one of the books that I admire rather than love, he's a very considered short story writer, and I find the consideredness, the consideration, means that they are a little cool for my liking. And I think there is always a problem if your short stories are aiming for this kind of perfection. One wrong note and they all fall apart. And I think he gets quite close to that at times. But I said I'm only 3 stories in, so I don't know. Blue Self-Portrait by Naomi Lefebvre. This is very short. It's published by the Fugitive Press in the UK. This is a great short novel, a great novella. Essentially, it's about a woman in her mid-30s on a plane with her sister coming out, leaving Berlin, where she's had a sort of she's met a pianist who's writing a piece of music about Schoenberg's Blue Self-Portrait, a painting, Schoenberg the composer, and she's just kind of musing on that meeting while reading the letters of Thomas Mann and Theodore Adorno. So it's kind of quite highbrow at that point, but she's incredibly kind of gauche and self-mocking. And there's an extended or a kind of leitmotif through it about the sadness of cows losing their calves. And it's written in kind of oblique, run-on, stream of consciousness sentences, but it's also very funny. It's a really, really strong piece of writing. Kid Gloves, Adam Mars-Jones. Adam Mars-Jones is a critic and novelist in the UK. What I didn't know is his father was a High Court judge, a QC and then a High Court judge, and obviously a very, very powerful personality in the family. And as he says in here, his father was one of those people in the sort of 60s and 70s and 80s who, who was one of the, who was a sort of extreme homophobe, and his son is gay. and the second half of the book is how they manage that relationship. But it's a very touching, tender, funny, interesting memoir. So there's that. Iris Murdoch's, so I've read all of that. Iris Murdoch's The Time of the Angels, which I've read twice. And I'm writing a short piece along with other things for The Guardian on this. She is a brilliant, brilliant writer. She's a brilliant, brilliant writer, but she can't really do story. It's just nuts. This. I'm calling it. It's a death of God soap opera. The Iron Age by Aja Kajermo. This is written in English by a Finnish novelist. It has pictures in it. I don't really do pictures in books. This is a short story that's been turned into a novel, not wholly successfully, but when it is successful, it is incredibly atmospheric, especially if, like me, you find Finland a strangely mysterious country, and it's kind of set post-Second World War, when Finland is a sort of kind of no man's land before it's... but it's a brilliant portrait of poverty in the very north, with a very powerful portrayal of a bullying, aggressive, but somehow vulnerable father. But if you're interested in broad Scandinavian, is Finland Scandinavia? Don't know, but anyway, if you're interested in kind of Finnish Scandinavian literature, this is a strong piece of writing. The Vanishing Man, Laura Cumming, In Pursuit of Velasquez. Velasquez is one of my favourite paintings. This novel is this biography, which is actually a detective story about a missing Velasquez painting, but actually it's a kind of broad biography of Velasquez, who didn't really leave much biographical information. So I'm not feeling that well today, so I'm slightly out of sorts. This is so well written. It's almost so effortlessly well written that you think it's actually a little bit kind of cursory and superficial, but it's not. It's just wonderfully well written. And interestingly, it slightly kind of parallels the fact that Velasquez had a kind of effortless technique. But really, this is if you're interested in the brilliance of Velasquez painting around that time, and really, really wonderful writing about art, this is one for you. Atrib and Other Stories by Ellie Williams. This is getting a lot of attention in the UK. I'm only about 3 or 4 stories in. They are wonderful short stories that all have a single conceit that is not unlike the conceit that goes before. I'm told that if you read the whole, they become more than the sum of their parts. The parts are very good. At the moment, I feel they're less than the sum of their parts, but I haven't finished it. On Being Blue, a philosophical inquiry by William H. Gass, who is probably one of the most interesting American writers of the 20th century. This is really just a riff on blueness from a man who likes to go deep into things in his own sort of kind of ornery sort of way, and it's quite extraordinary. Living with a Wild God. I haven't actually read this, but I bought this because of the review of it in the Francis Spufford book. Barbara Ehrenreich writes about a lot of kind of sociological subjects in the US. This is one about her kind of engagement with a transcendental force in nature that she's kind of unwilling to call God, apparently, and unwilling to submit to any kind of formal notions of the divine. So yeah, I haven't read it, so I don't know any more than that. The Lonely City, Olivia Lang, I mentioned her earlier. Olivia Lang is interesting compared to, if we think about The Vanishing Man, which is the book about I finished this Velasquez, whatever her name is, Laura Cummings, is that her name? Is I think in the end a better writer, but this is a more important book, because what Olivia Lang is doing is she takes 5 or 6 portraits of late 20th century and early 21st century artists, and looks at the notion of extreme existential loneliness, and that has often to do with sexuality, often to do with mental ill health, and often to do with being an artist at the time. But I think in the end it's an important and profound book, because I think it's opening up a way of looking at art and artists and being in the world, which seldom gets this much attention and sympathetic attention. So it's not written by a psychotherapist or a psychiatrist, but by an essayist and a writer about art. And I think it's quite a depressing book because of this, but it makes you realise that one can be a bit romantic about loneliness. The whole thing, are you alone or just lonely and all that nonsense. No, this is about really peeling the layers off and exposing what it feels like to be alone. And then finally, what I plan to start tonight, Volume 1 of George Orwell's Letters, Essays and Journalism. I've been planning to do this for about 20 years. It seems to me more and more that one needs to understand the 20th century. One needs to read people who were writing about it at the time, as well as reflect on writers who are writing about it now. And clearly, Orwell was one of the central writers of the first half of the 20th century. So I'm going to read that. That's it. Sorry I haven't been hugely articulate, but as I said, I'm feeling very unwell. My head is in a very strange place, and that's it. Thank you very much.